Good evening. Good evening and welcome. My name is Steve Etaw. I'm the president of the Door County Environmental Council. On behalf of the Board of Directors of the Environmental Council, I welcome you and thank you for your attendance. Whether you're here in person or virtually, we've got quite a few people virtually attending tonight. We have tonight what I believe you will find to be a very interesting program about Cape Cod. And I am going to introduce our speaker who is here with us virtually tonight in a few minutes. But before I do, I think the Environmental Council felt that our program would be more effective if I discussed a few of the challenges and threats that are facing Door County right now, so that when we watch and listen to our speaker, we can compare and contrast the threats and the challenges, as I like to call them, that are currently facing Door County. I'm going to try to run through some of those challenges relatively quickly, but I think it's important to establish what the problems are that we're looking at. And again, I prefer to call them challenges as opposed to problems. Like all of you, I have a deep love for Door County. I want to protect and preserve it as best we can. I was born here. I'm the 5th generation of my family to live here, and they, from early times on, they were in the hospitality business, and I grew up in the hospitality business, really the lodging and food end of the hospitality business, if you will. My grandparents owned the Hotel Ephraim, and I lived and worked there every summer until I graduated from college. So I know something about Door County, but I certainly don't know everything about Door County. We are facing a number of challenges in Door County. Some of them are relatively serious, but one of the early challenges that we have to think about is our ability to agree on things. And Door County doesn't easily always agree on things. I don't know if you knew that. Sometimes there's squabbling between villages. Sometimes there's squabbling between villages and townships. Sometimes there's squabbling between South Door County and North Door County, between Sturgeon Bay and North Door County. Sometimes there's squabbling between people in the various villages and towns on the boards. But one thing that we have in common, I think, is the true love of Door County. And I'm hoping that that love of Door County eventually will unite us and bring us together to manage the challenges that we have. One of the challenges that we have is contamination of our groundwater. Perhaps you remember, I guess it's probably been 5 years now since Dr. Borchard and Professor Maureen Muldoon did the intensive year-long residential groundwater study, well water study in Kewaunee County. With the results of that study came back, the term was, they were shocked by what the results were. They said the results were something that you expect to find in a third world country. Whoa. Well, those contaminants, I don't think have been corrected in Kewaunee County thus far. And guess what? Those contaminants, they didn't honor the county border at all. You know, they go wherever they want. We have that same groundwater contamination that Kewaunee County has in parts of Door County. Luckily, we're doing much more testing now in Door County so that people know what their water quality is, or have ability to know what their water quality is, and to make alternative choices for potable water if they need to, which is great. I'm much more concerned, however, with the other water in Door County, and that's the surface water. Surface water, as the name implies, is water that you find in streams, in rivers, in our inland lakes, in our ponds, in Lake Michigan, and in the Bay of Green Bay. The Bay of Green Bay is now being polluted, and that's the term I want to use, by phosphorus. Phosphorus, according to Dr. Val Klump, who is the dean of the School of Freshwater Science at University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee, is contaminating the bay. The southern parts of the bay are worse than the northern parts of the bay are currently. Dr. Klump tells us that we now have dead zones in the bay they're seasonal dead zones that occur in the summertime, but can extend from near the city of Green Bay all the way to Door County. A dead zone, as the name implies, are areas where nothing can live. You've probably heard about dead zones in the Gulf of Mexico or elsewhere that extend out into the Gulf 100 miles or so where there's nothing living. Well, now we have them in the Bay of Green Bay. I find that is serious, but really more daunting to me is the phosphorus is producing algae. Well, most algae, we're getting huge algae blooms, and most algae are harmless. They're that green, slimy stuff that you find in ponds and in ditches and so on, and generally is harmless. It's sort of a green or brown gook or that you really don't want to get on you, but it's harmless. Unfortunately, in the Bay of Green Bay, we're getting algae blooms of cyanobacteria, blue-green algae. Blue-green algae is toxic. What do you mean toxic, you're probably saying? Toxic in that if you get blue-green algae on your skin, you may well break out with a skin rash, and sometimes a severe skin rash. People can simply inhale it, and it affects your respiratory system, can put your respiratory system into distress. If you ingest it, it can make you very ill with digestive problems, flu-like symptoms. If your dog should happen to drink it, it can be fatal. Wow. Well, blue-green algae likes warm water, and the Bay of Green Bay is a lot of things, but generally not thought of as really warm water. Well, unfortunately, we've got global warming going on, and our Lake Michigan and the Bay of Green Bay and the other Great Lakes for that matter are all warming relatively rapidly. Blue-green algae really likes warm water. 79, 80 degrees is really perfect. Well, where do you think we could get water that warm in the Bay of Green Bay? We could get that water that warm in the very shallow beaches on a nice sunny day through the summer when we have a warm spell. We've got all of the phosphorus in the water is what the blue-green algae likes. And if we can get those water temperatures around 80 degrees with that, with all of the nutrients that phosphorus is, we're going to get outbreaks of blue-green algae in places that we don't want. Where would those places be, do you think? Well, could be places like Sand Bay, the Bay of Sturgeon Bay, Egg Harbor, Fish Creek, Ephraim would be real good. Sister Bay. That has not happened yet. We're not really seeing blue-green algae in northern Door yet in these harbors. And I'm in and on the water a lot and have not really seen blue-green algae, but here's the problem. By the time we see blue-green algae at those places, it's going to be too late. How do you stop it then? Once you have it, how do you stop it? And just imagine if we have blue-green algae at these places, what that would do to our tourism. What does it do to property values? What does it do to our quality of life here? What does it do to our economy? None of it is good. So we need to stop. We can't stop the warming of the water. We can try to slow it down, and we are with relative to climate change, global warming. But what we really need to stop is the phosphorus dumping into the Bay of Green Bay. And I'm kind of a zealot on this topic, so I need to move along. One of the other challenges that we have in Door County is over-tourism. Well, what do you mean by over-tourism? Is that just too many tourists? It's actually too many tourists at the same time, at the same place. That creates traffic problems. It creates parking problems. Maybe you've experienced them. And it diminishes the quality of life for people that live here, and it diminishes the quality of people that are visiting here. They don't want to be caught up in the traffic jam any more than you do. We also have a challenge of what I call overbuilding. We're seeing significant projects, commercial projects in some of our towns and villages that some people feel are too big, that they're out of scale, too big proportionately to the villages that they're in, that the architecture doesn't really fit with the rest of the village, and that perhaps provide too much density, too many people in these relatively small places. Sometimes there's problems with these projects with not adequate parking, not adequate green space, and so on. Well, people say to me, well, how are they letting them do that? How are they letting them do that? Well, who is the they? Well, the zoning people. You know, the zoning people. How did they allow that to go on? Well, we have 14 towns in Door County. 9 of the towns are in what's called Door County Comprehensive Zoning. 2 towns have their own zoning. 3 towns have no zoning, although one of the towns that has no zoning does have rules, which allows them to do some policing of what goes on. But just think about this. If you're in a town in Door County that has no zoning, and you're 1,000 feet from the water, from the Bay of Green Bay or Lake Michigan, think of the most offensive project that you can think of, that you can come up with. That project can occur there right next to your property if you happen to live there, and there is really nothing that you can do about it. And we're seeing projects that are happening where we do have zoning. Because the zoning is not detailed enough, is not accurate enough to stop whatever the particular project is that we might find offensive. These are challenges that we really have to face. You say, well, what are you talking about? I think there was one particular project that you're probably all aware of that I'm not going to name that went on this last year, where we had 4,500 people sign a virtual petition against that project. That project, a little bit modified, but it's happening. And why is that occurring? Because the zoning couldn't stop it. You have to have the rules in place before the project is presented. So we need to have good zoning. We have in Door County 6 or 7 different kinds of zoning because of the various towns that have their own zoning, and some of the villages have their own zoning. Sister Bay and Ephraim, Sturgeon Bay, et cetera, they have their own zoning that doesn't not necessarily conform to Door County zoning. So zoning is a problem. Last topic I want to talk about is housing. We have a challenge with housing as well. I think you probably saw in the paper this last week or two that the valuations of real property in Door County went up by $1.5 billion, billion with a B. Holy smokes. I remember when million was a lot of money. 10 million was really a lot of money. 100 million was astronomical. 1,000 million, I can't hardly think about. But so what's the problem with the fact that our property values have gone up? Isn't that a good thing? Well, it's a good thing unless you're a young working person that's trying to be in Door County. You can't afford a single family dwelling. You can't afford a condominium, and you probably can't afford an apartment any longer. Well, what does that do? Well, that means that you don't live in Door County, or you don't live in northern Door County, and maybe in Sturgeon Bay. What does that do? Well, we've got businesses that haven't opened this year because they couldn't get help. We have businesses that are open but have limited hours. I don't know if you've tried to go to a restaurant on a busy time during our summer, and they say, well, yeah, well, you can get on the list. It'll be an hour and a half wait or so. Gee, not everybody wants to wait an hour and a half. Again, a quality of life issue. Well, okay. Those are some of the main challenges that we're seeing to Door County. What does that have to do with Cape Cod? Well, we'd like to compare and contrast what Cape Cod has faced in the past and in the present. They've seen a lot of the same challenges that we are currently having, only they're ahead of us on dealing with it. Cape Cod, as you know, is a peninsula that juts out into the Atlantic Ocean, and Door County is a peninsula that juts out into Lake Michigan. Both of them are destinations and highly sought after vacation spots. Cape Cod is smaller than Door County geographically, less square miles, with less shorefront. They've got a lot, but less than Door County has. They are handling over 7 million visitors a year, way more than Door County has. How many people here have been to Cape Cod? Anybody? Oh my gosh, everybody's been to Cape Cod. Holy smokes. Well, I visited Cape Cod and I was impressed, as probably you were, with how good a job they've done in really preserving what I call the ambience of the place. And it's kind of has the feel of Door County to me. I thought, how in the world are they doing this? This is really good. Lots of woods and trees and not a lot of large projects, condominiums hanging off of every bluff and cliff and what have you. How are they doing this? Well, the Environmental Council got a hold of Cape Cod, who put us in touch with the Cape Cod Commission, who put us in touch with our speaker, who I'm finally going to introduce. Thank you for your patience. Aaron Perry joined the Cape Cod Commission staff in 2011, serving as Special Projects Manager prior to taking on the role of Deputy Director in 2019. Aaron manages regional planning efforts at the program level and engages communities during the planning process to build consensus. Aaron managed development and implementation of Cape Cod's area-wide water quality management plan. Okay. She has since contributed to the development of plans and decision support platforms on the topics of coastal resilience and hazard mitigation, climate change, economic development, and the Cape Cod Regional Policy Plan. Aaron received a Bachelor of Science in Biological Oceanography from Rutgers University and a Master of Arts in Marine Affairs from the University of Rhode Island. Without further ado, let's give a warm welcome to Aaron Perry.
Thank you very much. I am very happy to be here. I'm just going to take a minute to make sure I've got all my screen sharing up here. If you can't see my screen, please just holler and I will make sure I fix that. Thanks so much for the introduction. And I didn't expect to see quite as many hands raised there when Steve asked who had visited Cape Cod. So I have a little bit of a funny story before I jump into the content here. I was actually down just at the ice cream shop down the street recently with my two kids, and right there on the outside wall of the shop that is 5 minutes from my house, they always have a chalkboard up on the wall, and there's always a question there. My kids love to see it, and sometimes they like to answer it. It's what's your favorite beach, or where'd you visit today? And when we were there, the question was, where are you from? And the only answer on the board just a few days ago was Door County, Wisconsin. And I wish I had taken a picture, but it said something like, Door County is to Wisconsin as Cape Cod is to Massachusetts. And I just thought the timing of that was pretty funny. So I don't know if it was one of you there visiting us just over the long weekend, but it was a funny and kind of timely note for me to see there. So I'm very happy to be here today. I really enjoy working for the Cape Cod Commission. I've been here, as Steve said, for about 11 years now. The work we do is really important. It's really important to me. I think it's really important for the region, and it's just been a pleasure to be able to contribute to it. So happy to talk to you all about it as well. I'm going to take a little bit of time today to cover some of the history of how we came to be. And I'll talk a little bit about the purposes and powers that are provided by our enabling legislation. And then I'll talk a little bit about, our evolution over time, and a bit about our areas of focus right now and how we're addressing some of those critical regional challenges that we face. It sounds like maybe I didn't need this map. You all are aware of where we are, and much like Door County, we are, of course, a region completely surrounded by water. But we are made up of 15 individual and very unique communities. 14 of our 15 communities operate with a town meeting form of government. The 15th community has a town council, an elected town council. But given the nature of our local government, it is really critical that our residents are engaged and informed. Many of the critical decisions that are made, in our communities across our region, particularly about funding important projects, are made at town meeting. The commission plays, a significant role in providing some of those communication resources and engaging residents on our critical challenges. We are also home to 2 federal land holdings. So we have the Cape Cod National Seashore, which is over 4,300 acres out in the Outer Cape, and that attracts more than 4 million visitors annually. We also have Joint Base Cape Cod, which you see right up closer to what we call the Upper Cape, closer to the Cape Cod Canal and the rest of Massachusetts. And that base is home to 5 different military commands. So we have some significant federal partners here in the region as well. Many of you have traveled over these bridges, I assume. There are 2 vehicle bridges that provide access to the Cape, built back in the 1930s. These were designed to accommodate less than 1 million annual trips. And today we are seeing over 35 million annual trips. We have incredible coastal resource areas that provide, really important access for fishing, shell fishing, and other recreational activities. Our beaches draw millions of visitors annually. And even those, for those of you that are familiar, that are frequented by the sharks, the great white sharks out in the Outer Cape, we are still seeing, heavily populated beaches in those areas in the summer. And we have unique and vibrant downtown areas throughout the region. And we've got significant historic and cultural assets, all of which make our region special. Here you're looking at the Pilgrim Monument out in Provincetown, which provides incredible views of Cape Cod Bay, the rest of the northern part of Cape Cod, and the mainland of Massachusetts. And all of these assets have drawn residents and visitors to the region over the past many decades. The Cape Cod Commission was created in response to unprecedented growth and development in the region. And in the 1950s, we saw suburban style residential and commercial development really begin to increase and increase rapidly. Beginning in the 1960s is when we really saw it kind of skyrocket and continue through the 1980s. People were moving here in droves. It was described as a tidal wave of retirees coming to the region, as if everything were just being paved over. And so, at that time, towns were really limited in their ability to manage kind of that high demand and that increased growth. And there was really no kind of regional plan for growth and development across the Cape. At the same time as those development pressures intensified, many efforts by land trusts, communities, and others were made to protect open space for resource protection and for recreation. And as a result, today across the region, there's very little land actually left to accommodate future growth. 86% of the region's land area is actually either developed or protected, has some form of protection on it. So we have very little room left for additional protection or additional development. And over the course of that history, all of that kind of unabated demand through the 60s, 70s, and 80s, it did really stress our environment. It stressed our infrastructure, and it really significantly increased the cost of land in the region. And so in response, the Cape Cod Commission was created by an act of the Massachusetts legislature in 1990. We were created as the Regional Land Use Planning, Economic Development, and Regulatory Agency to serve the citizens in the 15 towns of Barnstable County. And our mission is broad, very broad, to protect the unique values and quality of life on Cape Cod by coordinating a balanced relationship between environmental protection and economic progress. And we've been working to further that mission for over 30 years now. We are one of 13 regional planning agencies that represent every town in the state. So every community across Massachusetts has access to a regional planning agency. That they're all covered by one of these 13 agencies. And each of the agencies works to address issues of regional importance. Each of these agencies works to develop comprehensive plans and recommendations in areas related to transportation, economic development, employment, the environment, and a host of other regional challenges important for the communities that they serve. And with the bit of research that I've done around your region, it seems that in terms of the types of roles that we play from a planning perspective, many of our regional planning agencies are similar to what you have in the Bay Lake Regional Planning Commission, certainly at a different scale. Cape Cod Commission represents a single county, and I think the Bay Lake Regional Planning Commission has 8 counties within its jurisdiction, so the scale is certainly different, but in terms of planning functions, a bit similar there. And so the predecessor to the Cape Cod Commission was the Cape Cod Planning and Economic Development Commission. We call it CapeCodCommission in case I slip with my acronyms. The original, this was essentially the original Cape Cod Regional Planning Agency. It was authorized by RPA legislation that was adopted by the state in 1965. And that is the legislation that created all 13 regional planning agencies. So CapeCodCommission worked to support the 15 Cape Cod towns. They worked heavily on water protection bylaws and solid waste management agreements at that time. But they also recognized that they were really limited in their ability to manage regional growth and more importantly, really mitigate its impacts. So acknowledged kind of those limitations of their role and oversaw over the course of a couple of years development of a strategic planning initiative called Prospect Cape Cod. And so this initiative brought together a number of different stakeholders to discuss environmental quality, land use, economic development, health and human services, housing, and a number of other challenges that the region was facing at the time. And they produced a document that included a number of different recommendations. One of the primary recommendations, the primary ideas advanced through that process was the development of a regional land use agency that had the powers to really address those weaknesses in existing land use decision-making processes at the local and regional scale. And so it was really a concerted effort, by the leaders of the region that came together through this process to really push for an agency that had a little bit more teeth. They acknowledged and recognized that the Cape was unique in that many of the developments that we were seeing at the time really did impact more than one community. But quite often they weren't as of a scale that necessarily triggered state environmental review. So they were essentially lacking that kind of important environmental review from the region's perspective, but having an impact that was pretty broad. And so as a result of kind of all of that coming together through that process, the Cape Cod Commission Act was drafted. At the same time as all of that was happening, a former US Senator who summered on the Cape, Paul Tsongas, began talking about a moratorium on all development on Cape Cod. He recognized and saw kind of what was happening to the region as others did. And this was an idea that he had. That created some concerns of its own, as you can imagine. The construction industry in our region was the largest employer on the Cape. And really many saw this as kind of taking one problem and swapping it for another. They thought it would have a significant impact on our economy, putting forward this entire moratorium on development in the region. And all of that together really led to the passage of the Commission Act. Ultimately, through all of those conversations and all of that time, creation of the Cape Cod Commission was actually seen as kind of the reasonable middle ground. It was clear that something needed to be done, that things couldn't continue as they had been, but it was also clear that an action like a moratorium on development across the region would have broad repercussions on the economy. And so the act was voted in 1989 and signed in 1990. And it found that the region possesses unique natural, coastal, historical, cultural, and other values that are threatened by uncoordinated or inappropriate uses of the region's land and other resources. It charged the Commission with carrying out its mission by leading, supporting, and enforcing development of regional plans, policies, regulations, and infrastructure to guide and manage growth, and specifically charged the Commission with supporting the 15 Cape Cod towns with both professional services as well as cost-effective planning and technical assistance. So we are unique from the other 12 regional planning agencies in that we are one of only 2 regional planning agencies in the state with regulatory authority. That was created by the Cape Cod Commission Act. The only other one in the state with regulatory authority is the Martha's Vineyard Commission, also created by its own act of the legislature. We are the only regional planning agency in the state that can authorize development impact fees to offset the impacts of the developments that are under our review. We're also the only regional planning agency that was authorized by a binding regional referendum. And so I was 7 when the commission was created. So I can talk a little bit about this history, and I think it's kind of a fascinating history to better understand. And I have been really lucky in that there are still a number of individuals who remain on the Cape, who were engaged in the creation of the commission, who I get to still work with on a regular basis, which is incredible. So following our 30th anniversary back in 2020, we started kind of talking about the need to capture some of this history. And we initiated development of kind of a documentary about the commission's history. And so that is available on our website, and I've shared the link with Mike and Steve. And I think if this is an issue and an area that is of interest to you, I would suggest watching the full documentary. It's only about 25 minutes long, but captures some of the nuances that I wasn't around for. And I thought just for this evening, I would play a couple of minutes, a short trailer really of the documentary so that you can hear directly, from some of the individuals that were involved in those early days of the commission.
I think it was largely environmental. People were, felt like the Cape that they had known and come to love was at risk.
The population growth from the 80s to the 90s in Mashpee and Sandwich were like 1 and 2 in the state.
It was not too unlike the Wild West. People were just doing speculative real estate development. People were moving here in droves.
The town simply didn't have the tools to deal with it. Feeling was, we need to do something. We need to get a hold of this.
The result was, of course, legislation that went through the House and the Senate, and a large signing and then a structure.
You're never going to win everyone over.
I would say in the very beginning, it was contentious and combative.
Everything was more pronounced in the early days because it was, everything was new and disruptive.
It took effect immediately. Towns started referring projects to the commission. We had to staff up.
Our relationship with the community, and we had to earn it. And we had to earn it in the press, and we had to earn it in every town hall in all 15 towns. And we did that.
Having the commission be this resource for the community is really important.
I think the commission has extraordinarily broad mission, but also extremely broad expertise and capability.
And I've been flying here for 43 years. And when you look at Cape Cod from the air, you don't see 15 towns. you see an environment that is connected, and you see resources that all overlap.
The commission has moved so beautifully from being purely a regulatory agency to be a role in which they help create data and resources that can facilitate appropriate development.
Looking at our coastal resilience, addressing climate change, we're in the middle of a housing crisis, while at the same time making sure we address our water quality issues.
The Cape Cod Commission is, the entity providing, evidence-based, uniform data, guidance, and a vision for, how we steward this special place in this special place called Cape Cod.
I was always struck when I was there at the Cape Cod Commission Act.
That's been in place and it's been, I think, as successful as we could have envisioned it to be.
So part of what the documentary and development of the documentary really put into focus for me is that the Cape Cod Commission Act is somewhat timeless. I'll talk a little bit about how our work has evolved over the years, but even as the commission has evolved and our work has evolved, the act has remained almost entirely the same, and it's truly been able to support all of our efforts. And I think, in part, that has a lot to do with kind of the broad purposes established in the act. And so through the purposes, the commission is charged with anticipating, guiding, and coordinating the rate and location of development with the capital facilities necessary to support that development. We're charged with reviewing developments that will have impacts beyond their local community, with identifying and protecting areas whose characteristics make them particularly vulnerable to the adverse effects of development. We're charged with preserving the social diversity of the Cape by promoting fair, affordable housing, promoting the expansion of employment opportunities, and implementing a balanced economic development strategy that's really capable of absorbing the effects of those seasonal fluctuations in the economy that we see. So, just reading through those purposes probably helps you a bit to understand why things were, as you heard in the documentary, contentious and combative initially. Striking that balance between environmental protection and economic progress is really hard. And those are two broad topics that many, I think, often feel are in conflict with one another. And even today, I would say that the commission's not always the environmental community's favorite agency. We're not always the developer's favorite agency, but I think as a region, we've really been able to show that it is possible to strike that balance. And that's where the commission plays a critical role. And so just to give you a little bit of a sense of, how we fulfill these purposes, we fulfill them through both our planning and our regulatory functions. On the planning side, we're charged with preparing and overseeing implementation of a regional policy plan. That provides the framework for everything that we do, and it's also a resource for our local communities to utilize as well. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the current version of the regional policy plan later on. We're also charged with preparing and overseeing a variety of other regional plans. So we have developed regional plans related to climate change, transportation, water quality, economic development, and I'll again give you some examples of those later on in the presentation. We provide direct technical assistance to each of our 15 towns. And then something that has become kind of a more important aspect of our work over the course of our history is that we serve as a regional data and information resource. This was a critical part of our work during COVID, which wasn't an issue that I ever thought we would be directly engaged in, but serving as that data and information resource ended up being a really critical role we could play. On the regulatory side, we have a number of responsibilities, some of which are quite complicated, to get into, in any depth maybe here. But our primary role on the regulatory side is that we review and regulate developments of regional impact. And developments of regional impact are essentially those developments that, whether because of their magnitude or the magnitude of their potential impacts, are likely to impact more than one community. And so in these cases where we are developing these reviewing these developments of regional impact, we review them for consistency with the regional policy plan, consistency with local zoning, consistency with the local comprehensive plans in the community if they are established, as well as through a benefits and detriments analysis, looking at the benefits and detriments to the region overall. So there are a few ways that these types of projects come to the commission. There are mandatory referrals. So if a project trips a number of mandatory thresholds, some of the more common ones being that if they are required to prepare an environmental impact report through the Massachusetts Environmental Policy Act, if they are 10,000 square feet of commercial space or larger, if there are 30 housing units or more, any division of 30 acres or more, all of those are required to be referred to the Cape Cod Commission and our DRIs, Developments of Regional Impact. A town can also kind of discretionarily refer certain types of projects to us as well if they have particular concerns around a project's impacts to one or more resources or values identified in the Act. So kind of regardless of how that project comes to us, whether it's a mandatory or a discretionary referral, at that time, all local permitting stops. And so in terms of the process, a project that triggers our review goes through our review. And if it's approved, it can then proceed to local permitting. If it is denied, the project stops. There's no local permitting, and the project is essentially dead. It doesn't move forward. We also have a number of other regulatory tools. So we negotiate development agreements. These are typically for projects that are larger in scale. Their implementation timeframe will be kind of a longer period of time, typically longer than 7 years. It's projects where the future phases are not fully developed yet, but they really benefit from that kind of early review and comprehensive review and planning that will allow for kind of the more the more efficient provision of infrastructure. So these are usually those projects that have multiple uses, have multiple structures, multiple phases. And then we also recommend districts of critical planning concern. So this regulatory tool allows either a single town or a group of towns to impose a moratorium on certain types of development or activity for a specified period of time. And that specified period of time then allows the community to plan and adopt regulations that protect one or more values identified in the Cape Cod Commission Act. And so all of our regulatory matters, any one of those kind of issues that I just outlined goes through extensive public comment and public hearing processes. And so working to kind of accomplish all of that is both a professional staff and our 19-member board. So our board includes representation from each of the 15 Cape Cod towns. They are appointed by their select boards. We have a county commissioner representative, a minority representative, a Native American, and a governor's appointee. And the board is primarily responsible for reviewing those regulatory projects and either approving or denying the project. Our professional staff is led by an executive director. We have approximately 40 staff, and those staff provide expertise in a variety of different issue areas: water and natural resources, transportation, community and economic development, land use planning, GIS, legal and regulatory issues. And those 40 members of our staff are responsible for development of regional plans, providing direct technical assistance to communities, and evaluating the regulatory projects, and providing that expertise and those recommendations to the commission board. And so the debate around kind of creating the commission, was certainly, to some degree polarizing. There were a variety of different viewpoints. And, as an agency, certainly in the time that I've had experience working here, but from what I understand for really the entirety of the agency's existence, we have worked very hard and continue to work very hard to develop and maintain partnerships. They are really critical to the work that we do. We work with non-governmental entities, all levels of government as well as private entities in a number of different capacities. So with the non-governmental organizations, typically we partner with these entities on different projects. We work with them on the committees that we staff. We sometimes, have staff from our office that sit with staff from our regional non-governmental organizations on various committees as well. One of the organizations that we work very closely with is the Association to Preserve Cape Cod, which is very similar to the Door County Environmental Council, just in terms of the issues that they're focused on and the work that they do. We also work, again, as I said, with all levels of government. We administer federal grant programs and project funds. Our region is a federally designated economic development district, which allows us to access federal economic development administration funds that we wouldn't otherwise be eligible for. And we administer that. We partner with the state to advance initiatives. We've done this through our transportation program, as well as on issues related to coastal resiliency and climate change and water quality. And then we are part of Barnstable County government, and we provide services to, through, and in partnership with county departments. And of course, we support the towns in the work that they do too, and in aligning their local planning efforts with the regional plan. And on the private side, much of our interaction with private entities is in our regulatory capacity, but we do work with private entities through the committees that we support, and we engage with them in our stakeholder processes that are associated with the development of our different regional plans. So typically we try to pull in all perspectives on those regional planning processes, and the private entities and the private sector are really critical in that as well. So they're engaged along with any other number of organizations and interested citizens in those processes. We are charged with conducting an annual conference, and this has been done in a number of different ways over the course of our history. But what has really, I think, kind of been a really beneficial effort for the entire region is the One Cape Summit. And so this has been presented annually since 2015. It was originally launched to chart the progress that we were making on regional water quality planning, and was really focused on the issues that we face around wastewater and the lack of wastewater infrastructure we have in the region. We brought together all 15 boards of selectmen and town councilors as part of that first meeting, as well as a number of other stakeholders, interested citizens. It was an open public meeting, and it has since become kind of an anticipated, region-wide forum on a variety of other issues. And so we typically focus on particular issues each year, but it's really all revolving around, those issues that intersect both the environment and the economy in the region. And so just to give you a little bit more perspective on how, the work that we did when we first, we were first formed as an agency to what we do today, I'd like to walk through just a bit of that history and evolution. And I think it's kind of helpful to really see kind of the progress we've made and again, how we've evolved into the agency that we are now. Things were certainly very different in 1990 when the Commission Act was signed. At that time, the population was just over 184,000 people. The cost of housing was still relatively low, and the demand for regulation was high. In the first year after the commission was created, we reviewed 29 developments of regional impact. During that decade alone, we reviewed 202 developments. And the focus of the commission was really, again, heavily weighted toward that regulatory work in response to kind of everything that had led to its creation. The region continued at that time to see some significant residential development and large commercial development proposals. The first regional policy plan, adopted just about a year after the commission was created, really set forth the vision of protecting the best of Cape Cod and repairing the mistakes of the past. My impression of that kind of first decade is that there was just so much pressure and demand for regulation that the commission really had less of an ability to focus on the regional vision, the planning, and the technical assistance. As an agency, we just didn't have the flexibility to be kind of overly forward thinking. I think the community felt that we were really kind of in that emergency state. We really needed to address the issues that had been plaguing the region in the decades leading up to it. And so that being said, though, there were a number of different efforts to protect natural resources, specifically around groundwater protection. And so staff at the commission were very much engaged in working with the state to identify and develop groundwater protection districts. And that was a key focus in terms of a kind of planning and environmental protection component of the work that they did at that time. In 1994, just 4 short years after the commission was established, 6 communities did attempt to extricate themselves from the commission, and they were unsuccessful in each of those 6 instances. By the 2000s, the region saw an uptick in population, about 19%. The cost of housing, though, increased significantly more, around 45%. There was really still a strong focus on our regulatory work, but with a bit fewer regulatory projects over the course of that decade. It was just upwards of 150 regulatory projects over the course of the 10 years. And at the same time, the agency really tried to increase its focus around strategic planning and opportunities for regulatory flexibility. The iteration of the policy plan, the regional policy plan developed during this time, separated the regulatory and planning aspects of our work and really attempted to position the agency to focus on planning moving forward, and to really be more forward thinking and visionary in terms of what the region needed moving forward. Staff worked to create what was called the Regional Land Use Vision Map. And they also really focused on amplifying their targeted technical assistance to communities. They established a program called the RESET program, Regional Economic Strategy Executive Team. Is essentially an opportunity for towns to request assistance for a particular geographic area. And then the commission puts a dedicated and interdisciplinary team together to support comprehensive planning for that particular location. Over the course of the 2000s, we continued to see water quality in the region decline. Particularly coastal water quality. And that really began to become a focus of the commission. An additional emphasis was placed on building collaborative relationships to support planning, particularly around water quality, but more broadly as well. And then in the 2010s, following the recession, we saw a slight decrease in population, but quite a large increase in the cost of housing, up about 68%. As you'll see, there was a significant decrease in regulatory projects, down to 70 over the course of the decade. And at that time, I think it really became apparent that there was little room left for development of that large scale kind of residential or commercial project. Tying back to the map I showed earlier, most of the land was really either already developed or protected, and fewer of those large scale projects were coming forward. And there was really a call from the communities, not just a need identified by the commission and its staff, but others in the region to engage in that more proactive planning, really with a focus on supporting appropriate redevelopment, necessary infrastructure, and also continue to focus on that critical natural resources protection. During this decade is when it seems the commission really made that transition from being often in more of a reactive role to serving in more of that proactive and forward-thinking capacity. And so during this time, the commission focused on increasing community engagement, and then focused on developing regional plans to address those regional challenges that we were facing. We completed planning necessary to gain that economic development district designation that I mentioned earlier, which is really critical for our region because under circumstances where that designation isn't in place, our communities actually are very few. I'll say I think it's 2 census tracts are actually eligible for the EDA grants that this designation now makes the entire region eligible for. So that was a really critical role of the commissions at that time, and it remains critical for us to maintain that designation. We also work to implement different regulatory tools that provide, relief for certain types of development in certain areas, opportunities where what we call growth incentive zones can allow certain types of development and increased density in areas that can accommodate it, and areas that are away from our important natural resource protection needs. And then, one of our most significant undertakings was completing an update to the regional water quality management plan to address the declining coastal water quality that we were seeing across the region. I could talk, for the next hour about just this work. It is the reason I came to the commission, and I'm fortunate to have been engaged in this process. It was one of the most comprehensive planning processes with the most intensive stakeholder engagement that we've worked on, and it's resulted in considerable action to reduce the impacts to our coastal water quality across the region. And it also led to creation of the Cape Cod and Islands Water Protection Fund. That was enacted back in 2018, and it's something that I think might be of interest to you all because it does provide a dedicated revenue source to construct wastewater treatment infrastructure and complete water quality projects, acknowledging that wastewater is the biggest contributor to our coastal water quality issues on the Cape. And that we have to provide that wastewater infrastructure to accommodate the seasonal influx of visitors that we see on an annual basis. The dedicated revenue source that funds the Water Protection Fund is a 2.75% excise tax on short-term rentals. So it's really been a way for us to kind of increase revenue for these types of really critical projects, and has helped us to identify a way for those seasonal and short-term visitors to support the critical infrastructure investments that we need to ensure that we can continue to accommodate that seasonal economy as well. It's been quite successful to date. Actually, we have the management board that oversees that fund has awarded nearly $100 million in projects since it was established in 2018. And then here we are, in the 2020s, we've seen an increase in population over what we had back in 2000. In 2020, the cost of housing rose to $479,000. And I'll say in June of this year, the median sales price was actually over $700,000. We have an annual median income, a median household income of right around $80,000. So we are in a significant housing crisis as well. But over the last 2 years, kind of the role that we play around regulatory review is less. We've seen, fewer than 10 regulatory projects over the course of those couple of years. Hard to say whether that's normal or not, given COVID, and who can predict what it would have happened otherwise. But the magnitude of the regulatory work that we do is much less than it has been in the prior decades. Our focus today is really on aligning our regional plans and working with communities to align local plans with regional plans. We know that we have to focus on the future, and that we really need to guide development and more importantly, redevelopment to appropriate locations. And that we really need to focus on those critical strategies, those key strategies for addressing our regional challenges. And so the vision in this iteration of the regional policy plan is that growth should be focused in centers of activity, areas that are supported by adequate infrastructure, and really guided away from those areas that need to be protected for ecological, historical, or other purposes. We also, in this regional policy plan, really consider context. Development needs to be responsive to context, and it needs to allow for the restoration, the preservation, and the protection of our unique resources, while also promoting the economic and community resilience aspects of our region. So today, we're no longer the commission that's working to repair those past mistakes, but we've really been able to transition to providing more of a vision and guiding development and protection efforts moving forward. We also think about our region in terms of systems, and we know that our natural built and community systems are interdependent. None is more important than the other, and each comes with its own challenges, some of which overlap and some of which are, challenging to address, without impacting another system. So it's quite intertwined and, a challenge to work through. But we know that, planning for a resilient region really requires that we understand those interdependent systems. And we need to consider how they vary by geographic context. So we know every area across the Cape is not the same, that we have 15 different communities, and within that we have tens of different villages. And so the regional policy plan that was adopted in 2018, was designed around place types. So each of the types of locations that you see here on the screen exist in our region, and each of these place types has its own vision and strategies for increasing resilience. This kind of place type strategy or framework is applied both in our planning work, but then also in our regulatory review. So when we do review regulatory projects, now we review them in the context of the place type they are located within. And so just to give you a quick sense, I'm not going to walk through all 8 of the place types, but just to give you a sense of the visions, I'll touch on kind of our natural areas. The vision for these areas is to minimize adverse development impacts, focus on our sensitive resources, preserving lands that define our natural landscape, that contribute to our scenic character, and really to overall improve the Cape's resilience to storms and the effects of climate change. We know that our natural landscapes provide important buffers to the climate impacts that we're facing, are important for carbon sequestration, and so we want to maintain those. And on, kind of the other end of the spectrum, we've got our community activity centers. These are areas where, we can really accommodate additional mixed use and multifamily residential development, and where we have walkable, vibrant areas where there are diverse services and recreation and civic spaces and existing housing and job opportunities. So these are our more compact areas. And just to give you a sense of where those areas are across the Cape, there were 17 regional community activity centers identified in the 2018 regional policy plan based on existing community activity, existing business activity, and the compact form that is present in those areas. And so they're very discrete areas, across the region. And they are areas that have existing infrastructure like wastewater or pedestrian infrastructure, or where there are plans for that infrastructure in the near future. These are the areas where we're also focusing some of our planning to support additional infrastructure investments. And so just finally to touch a little bit on our regional challenges. I'm sure that nothing on the screen you see here is surprising. These are national challenges that you all are facing, that we're facing, but each of them has some nuance that is unique to the Cape. And the Commission's role is really critical in guiding the development of the plans that will include strategies to address each of these challenges, and in providing technical assistance to the communities who, in many cases, are the ones who must forward those strategies through the implementation phase and the funding phase. So, that is the role that we're playing in our region on each of these challenges. So just to touch very briefly on each of these and touch a little bit on what we're doing currently. As I mentioned, Cape Cod's coastal waters are impaired by nitrogen, primarily from septic systems. We have very little wastewater infrastructure, but we know that especially our coastal water resources are really critical to the region's economy. 34 of our 53 coastal embayments require nitrogen reduction to achieve water quality goals. And now we also know that freshwater ponds and lakes are at risk from pollutants. We are seeing the cyanobacteria blooms as well, and those are becoming more prevalent on an annual basis. And so I won't go through all of this, but to give you a sense of what we're doing, the Cape Cod Freshwater Initiative is something that we have just recently launched. It is modeled in large part after the work that we did on coastal water quality. and is a science-based and information-driven planning process to engage stakeholders, enable action, and really achieve protection and restoration of our ponds and lakes. Ultimately, the goal of this effort, like much of the work that we do, isn't to define a preferred solution for the region or for any of our 15 communities, but really to develop a framework that will make action easier. And so our goals here are to provide resources that will support local decision-making, to provide access to the data and information that will help us all to target investments, and then to track progress moving forward and help communities and others make adjustments in the actions that they're taking. Outside of our regulatory capacity, we can't necessarily make any community do anything in particular. We can deny projects. The commission can say no to projects that trip our thresholds if they are not consistent with the regional policy plan or consistent with local zoning, local comprehensive plans, or if their detriments outweigh their benefits. But in terms of a lot of these proactive approaches, our role here is to enable action. And we've been successful in doing that on a number of issues, and we are working to do that on freshwater as well. Climate change is impacting every aspect of our life, every aspect of our natural built and community systems. We are incredibly vulnerable. 19% of the region's land area is located in the floodplain. We have $16 billion in assessed property value in the floodplain. About 30% of our towns identified critical facilities, places like hospitals, police stations, schools, childcare facilities. Those are located in the floodplain as well. We've got about 1,500 inventoried historic structures that are located in the floodplain. So those are critical to our culture and our history. And then overall, it has been estimated that as a region, we could see $50 billion in losses through the end of the century if we don't take action to address climate change and its impacts. And so we have significant losses ahead of us if we don't take action. And so at the commission, we've created tools that allow communities to understand their vulnerabilities. These tools allow communities to weigh potential, coastal resiliency strategies based on cost or their overall impact, the ecosystem services that they impact. And this tool in particular, our coastal planner, is available for any segment of shoreline across the entire region. So it's a tool that's accessible to all. We've also calculated our regional greenhouse gas emissions. So we have a regionally specific greenhouse gas emissions inventory, recognizing that we need to contribute to the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions in order to be successful in limiting the impacts that we and others face as well. So we need to be a part of that global solution. And this inventory allows us to establish a baseline, better understand our highest emitting sectors, and we're able to really measure progress toward climate mitigation as we move forward. We've incorporated all of that into the Cape's first climate action plan. That was completed about a year ago, so we are just in the implementation phase now. And the climate action plan outlines 11 different priority strategies, both related to mitigation and adaptation. So we recognize that both approaches are really critical. And now, we are working with partners to really identify opportunities to implement recommendations associated with that plan. We're actively engaged in what is called our low-lying roads project right now, where we have all 15 Cape Cod communities completing a vulnerability assessment of their roadways and identifying their top roadways based on criticality of the roadway and the extent of vulnerabilities, and we're working with them to develop conceptual adaptation plans. So really positioning them to be able to take those plans and move forward to the next phase to find funding for final design and hopefully ultimately implementation. We know that our infrastructure is aging. I touched on our 2 bridges a little bit ago, and that our infrastructure needs are changing. So we've got, again, aging infrastructure and changing needs. We know that expanded transportation infrastructure, wastewater infrastructure, water infrastructure, electric and broadband infrastructure is all necessary to support economic stability in the region. We also know that our development patterns make infrastructure more expensive. We are, the sprawl type of development that we, are living with and are contending with makes it more expensive on a per unit basis. And often providing infrastructure to that pattern of development can result in further disturbance of our natural resources. So it's a challenge that we face regularly. We maintain, in part to address these issues, a regional transportation plan. And that plan considers the unique challenges we face as well as the opportunities in the region. It establishes funding for, priorities for funding, allocation and assistance. It ties directly to our regional policy plan and looks really broadly at multimodal transportation needs, really to support that region, the region's growth policy. So there's the pedestrian-oriented infrastructure, incorporated into this plan in addition to the other forms of, roadway infrastructure, ferries and public transit. And there is a lot I could say about the region's housing challenges. Overall, we lack, diversity in housing options. About 83% of our units are single-family homes. About a third of our units are second homes, typically used for just a couple months a year. And as I mentioned, the median sales price just a few months ago was over $710,000. The income needed to affordably purchase that median home is about $160,000. And we know that our household income is roughly half that for renters. It's far less, just under $47,000 a year. We also know that we have very few year-round rental opportunities, and we have less than a 1% vacancy rate for those rentals that we do have. And so renters are faced with, significant challenges, even more so than homeowners perhaps in our region. And so what we are working to do and what we have just launched is development of a regional housing strategy, much like the freshwater initiative and the coastal water quality work that we've done and other regional planning efforts. We here are working to establish the baseline information, better understand the existing housing landscape in each of our communities. We're working with a local educational institution to complete a needs assessment to better understand supply and demand. We are just completing a resident survey that really attempts to better understand the needs of our year-round residents, both homeowners and renters. And we're doing broad research on different strategies, whether they be public outreach strategies or zoning and regulations or funding mechanisms, strategies that other communities have used in Massachusetts, but across the country. That we could potentially incorporate, or at least evaluate and potentially incorporate into an overall housing strategy for the region. And as part of that strategy, we will provide resources to the community, including residential design guidelines. Those will incorporate net zero design guidelines to address climate along with our housing challenges. We'll develop model bylaws that communities will then be able to take, perhaps amend to suit their needs and adopt kind of more expeditiously than if they had to develop those bylaws from scratch or on their own. We know that we have both wealth and poverty on Cape Cod. We are often looked at from afar as a region with considerable wealth, but we actually have a fairly even split of low income residents, middle income residents, and high income residents, about a third, give or take, of each. We know that our wages in our top industries aren't sufficient to support living on Cape Cod. We know that our industry mix reflects heavily, on tourism and our reliance on tourism. We've got a strong second home market. We've got a significant retiree population, and it's just a challenge that we all struggle with. Our year-round residents, are not the residents that people are thinking of when they think of Cape Cod. And there's a lot of struggle here, I think, to afford life in the region on a year-round basis. And so part of what we do is to develop and maintain a comprehensive economic development strategy. This really focuses on creating the playing field for a vibrant economy. And there are a number of different initiatives that are included in the framework. This is the current economic development strategy. We'll be up to begin a development of an updated strategy next year. But this focuses a lot on local business development and development of sectors like the blue economy sectors, those types of businesses that can support those higher wage jobs. The plan also addresses a number of our infrastructure challenges, and anything identified in the SEDS is ultimately, if appropriate funding opportunities come forward through the Economic Development Administration, is ultimately eligible for funding, through those Economic Development Administration programs. This plan was actually completed in 2019, and it has been, so prior to the pandemic, but it has been instrumental in supporting economic recovery and resiliency to the pandemic impacts. It has, provided a pathway for economic resilience that I think is probably more important now than it ever was before, than it was when we developed it. But many of its initiatives actually align with the eligible uses of the American Rescue Plan Act funds and other federal funds that are coming through in response to the pandemic impacts. So it's been a valuable resource from that perspective. And just finally, not that I want to talk about COVID for much longer at all, but I'll touch a little bit on our role here. It's certainly not an area I anticipated us spending our time on a few years ago, as I'm sure nobody expected, the state we've been in for the last few years. But the technical expertise we have at the commission and the collaborations that we've established with other entities and organizations really positioned us to be able to support response, recovery, and resiliency to the pandemic. Early on in the pandemic, we partnered with the county's health department and the region's healthcare system to develop a community alert system, web-based application. And so that allowed everybody in the region and beyond to access case counts that were regularly updated for the entire region. And to accompany that, we developed a website called Data Cape Cod. This website was originally strictly data associated with the pandemic impacts. It provided information for us and others to use in better understanding and kind of characterizing the impacts that we were seeing across the region. But it has since evolved into kind of a data hub. It allows us to track progress, toward resiliency. It provides critical data for decision making on in a number of different areas, and it's been expanded to include far more data sets that are useful for a broader range of planning and economic development work. We envision this will continue to expand and will continue to help us tell the story of Cape Cod and its economy well beyond the COVID-19 pandemic. And it's a resource that's been used quite broadly by our community. And so, I know you were perhaps most interested in the Act and the history of the commission, and I think that our more recent work contributes to better understanding kind of that timelessness of the Act that I mentioned earlier. The purposes and the powers that are provided by the Act are really broad. And the Act has remained relatively untouched over the last 32 or so years. But the way that we achieve our mission, of balancing economic progress with environmental protection, and we like to say kind of simply working to keep a special place special, that continues to evolve. And so, as we continue to evolve as an agency, the Act has provided us with the flexibility really that allows us to be responsive to the needs of the community. And so while we are no longer kind of the same agency we were when we were created back in 1990, and our challenges as a region have evolved, the Act really supports the work that we do and supports us in continuing to do that work. So I hope that was helpful, and I am happy to answer any questions that anyone has.
We're going to have a question and answer period. If folks would like to stand up and stretch before we do that, feel free to. We're going to have a mobile mic here. Bill is going to walk around. If you've got a question, please feel free to ask. This has been great. Who's got a question?
Before I do that, I just want to indicate to Aaron that I am a fellow Rutgers Scarlet Knight. I wore my red hoodie tonight just for you. I know all 3 stanzas of the alma mater, but I couldn't find my keys or my phone tonight. So that's where I am. Start from front to back. So if anybody has a question, raise your hand.
Don't be bashful. Here we go.
I want to ask this gentleman over here, what is the land of Ward County compared to CapeCod versus the population of this state? What? It's only the land of
Here, but let me go back here.
Yeah, I'd like to just. No? Okay. What is the land mass in Door County versus a land mass in Cape Cod? And they said the population there now is 225,000 people. And what is it in Door County now?
According to Google.
Yeah.
Wikipedia, population of Door County is 27,621. So it's 10 to 1. And the area is 2,370 miles. Square miles. The population in Door County is about 1/10 of Cape Cod, and the area I think Cape Cod is a little bit smaller than Door County.
It is, definitely.
Yeah.
So,
that's what I thought.
but both are under the jurisdiction of one county, Barnstable versus Door.
Other questions?
Aaron, can you hear me? Yeah,
I
so
can, yes.
I have 2 questions. One is I was curious just to find out like who the people were that were involved that were initially getting the Cape Cod Commission started, if they were more local government, state officials, was there, a local move to do it from local people? And then the other question I had was related to how the Cape Cod Commission is funded, where your funding support comes from.
Sure. So, the first is there were a number of people engaged in this effort. The Prospect Cape Cod process that identified the recommendation to create the commission had a wide range of stakeholders. But my understanding, and some of this is talked about in the full documentary, we had a very dedicated legislative delegation from the state, from the Cape Cod region engaged in it. We had county commissioners engaged in it. We had a number of other leaders from regional organizations who were engaged. Many of the individuals you saw in the trailer are former state representatives or senators who were engaged, but then a number of entities from some of our regional organizations that were focused on the environment and other, land trust type organizations. So it was pretty wide ranging, but we had a very engaged legislative delegation as well. And just your second question on the funding source, the Cape Cod Commission does have a dedicated funding source, essentially an annual tax on properties that funds, I would say about half of the work that we do, but we are very opportunistic in the grants that we, seek out and have been very successful, in terms of receiving both state and federal grants to do the work that we do. Grants make up about half of our annual budget.
Any other questions?
I have a question.
Hold on 1 second.
What is your annual budget?
Sure. It's, give or take, around five or so million.
5 or so million.
5 to 6.
It's from what you mentioned, all of the land in Cape Cod is either protected or developed already. Is that true?
About 86%
Right.
is already protected or
Am I
developed.
correct in saying that that is not the situation that we have in Door County at all?
No, it isn't, but at the same time, when this commission was started, it was far less than Cape Cod.
Is that true? Back when the commission was developed, that was far less developed? I
You
know
know,
you were formed because of the scare of development, of the flood of us folks or other people, but it was much less developed back then?
I hope I heard the whole question. I'm sorry, I cut out just a little bit. But at the time that the commission was created, we had seen some considerable development in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. I can't say that at that time that the commission was developed, that it was 86% that was already protected or developed, but we had seen a significant development already occur. I don't have the exact percentage.
Mike, you had a question?
Is it correct in my understanding that part of your budget, your source of funding comes from a room tax?
It's called the Cape Cod Environmental Protection Fund. So it's an assessment on each property in the region. The rooms tax, if you heard me probably mention around the Cape and Islands Water Protection Fund. So there is a 2.75% excise tax that was enacted in 2018. That is on short-term rentals, both the hotel, motel, and the more kind of Airbnb, VRBO type short-term rentals, and that is strictly dedicated to water quality and wastewater projects. And that's separate from the commission's budget.
Hold on, Aaron.
Sure.
With regard to your water initiative, have you specifically banned the use of fertilizer and herbicides within freshwater and bay areas?
Sure. So that's actually an interesting and timely question. So in some of our 15 communities, during development of our 208 plan, our regional water quality management plan, some of those communities already had regulations around fertilizer, not bans necessarily, but during development of the 208 plan, the state actually, I'll try to be brief in describing it, but essentially, asserted jurisdiction over the regulation of fertilizers, and gave that jurisdiction to the Department of Agricultural Resources. At that time, the commission was able to use our District of Critical Planning concern process, that regulatory tool I briefly mentioned, to actually create a regional district of critical planning concern for fertilizer. And that allowed a brief period of time for communities to adopt local regulations to regulate fertilizers prior to those, to kind of that jurisdiction being turned over to the Massachusetts Department of Agriculture. Some communities took advantage of that and some did not. Again, these weren't bans, but these were local regulations on fertilizer. So not all of our communities have fertilizer regulations. However, there has been a recent move toward, by one community right now on the Cape to put forward a citizens petition to ban fertilizer. That will have to go through a legislative process, and I certainly don't know the outcomes of that just yet, but it's something that at least one of our town meetings is taking up this fall.
Okay.
I've got a question, Aaron. How in the world did you get the 15 towns to cooperate? We have 14 towns here, and I think it would be a real feat.
Sure. I couldn't hear that
works
one.
Better. My question, Aaron, is how did you get the 15 towns in Cape Cod to cooperate to start the Cape Cod Commission? We have 14 towns here in Door County, and I think it would be a major feat to get the 14 towns to agree on anything, because that's just difficult. We are diverse in Door County. Our towns are quite different depending on the area that you're in.
Yep. So I think, you know, I don't know that they all did. I don't know that they all went cooperatively down kind of the path of supporting the commission. As you may have heard me mention, just 4 years after the commission was created, we had 6 towns attempt to kind of extricate themselves from the commission. When I first started at the commission back in 2011, and I can't remember if it was 2011 or 2012 that this actually happened, we had a number of towns attempt that again. I think towns have different opinions on the commission, though I think that that's not necessarily the case today. I think that we, in the work that we do now and that we have done over the past 10 or 11 years, from my experience, we collaborate with the towns. We provide resources to the towns. They see us as a resource. They use the model bylaws that we develop. They participate in our planning processes, and they recognize that we're all facing this, same challenges. While they might be nuanced for the individual communities, I think the work that we do in terms of regional planning is broad enough to encompass the individualities of the different communities. And, I think that as the regional policy plan has evolved and we've placed more of an emphasis on the, kind of context sensitivity and those place types that I talked about, the towns are recognizing that we understand that they are all different communities, that even within their community, they are different villages, and that they have different needs. And so a lot of what we do really just provides that framework for them to make better informed local decisions. And so today, I think that, collaborating with our 15 towns is not in any way the same kind of process, or not process, but same. It doesn't bring the same kind of concerns as maybe it did in the early days of the commission.
Aaron, you seem to have some very good data there. And one of the things, a lot of us have other homes on the oceans, other places. In the 30 years that you've been in business there, what has the ocean risen?
Oh, I don't actually know the answer to that question off the top of my head. I know more about what we're expecting to see in the coming years, but I could get back to you with that. We're expecting through the end of the century, up to 10 feet of sea level rise. Obviously there's wide ranging estimates depending on how you look at it, anywhere from 5 to 10 feet, but and we've certainly seen significant sea level rise over the last 30 years.
Cape Cod has experienced 11 inches of sea rise since 1990.
11 inches of sea rise in Cape Cod.
Since 1990?
In 100 years.
Oh, in 100 years.
Back
okay.
here, I'm sorry.
Yes.
So Door County has actually 19 different municipalities. Some of them are villages, so not all of them are towns. We have one city. Are there other forms of government on the Cape? I can't recall, or is it only towns? And if there were others, would you have been able to have this legislative oversight or this commission oversight of all of those different forms of government?
So yes, the simple answer is the first part of the question is we have, yes, just towns. So we've got 14 towns that have the town meeting form of government. We've got 1 town with a town council. And, in terms of whether or not we'd be able to have the same, legislative oversight, I don't know. Hard to say, not having been involved in those earlier stages of the process, but essentially, our responsibility is not to require any of the 15 towns to do anything specific. We have, kind of the responsibility to look at development and plan for growth and development and protection of our resources across the entirety of the land area, the region, kind of regardless of those town boundaries. And I guess I'm not sure how that would change anything in terms of either our planning or our regulatory capacity, whether or not they were the kind of the current town governments that we have today, or if they were other forms of government in the region.
I just had one more question. Do you have a step-by-step guide on how you formed your commission?
I would say the documentary is the best, the best resource for that. Now, you certainly reached out, with questions about the commission, at the right time. We didn't have a documentary before, fairly recently. But that would be the best resource to point you to. Certainly, reviewing the act and perhaps the Prospect Cape Cod document, that really was the origination of the recommendation, could potentially be helpful as well.
Aaron, thanks for your presentation. Just a quick question. You kind of frame your discussion on economic versus environmental. I think there's another aspect that we're experiencing here in Door County, and that's the whole notion of community sustainability. And I think, one of the challenges that we're facing with the workforce housing shortages, which means, parents can't move in here and raise families. It's putting stresses on schools since we're losing school census. And with groups in your area, such as Barnstable Watch, where they're trying to manage quality of life versus the more commercialization of short-term rentals and basically taking houses, if you will, out of the market that can be used for families or be used for workforces. How is your commission dealing with that?
Sure. Those are issues that we'll be taking up during development of the regional housing strategy. We're looking at, how other locations, look at short-term rentals, how other locations kind of address the need for, for example, multi-family developments. I think we're looking very broadly at how to provide for that workforce housing. I think, one of the issues that I think is challenging, to deal with being, a primarily single family home community is the thought of, multifamily housing development, which much of our workforce may need or want. People think of that as these large scale apartment complexes or, larger scale developments. We want to also look at opportunities where, infill development of smaller multifamily units might be appropriate in areas where, like our activity centers that I identified in the map earlier, where there's existing infrastructure, there's opportunity to increase density and really avoid development in areas, that are more sensitive, and to really, avoid creating any more type of sprawl development. So, the short-term rental issue is one that our communities are struggling with. I think communities have, I'm sure everywhere, but on the Cape even, have different kind of tolerance for short-term rentals. But it's an issue we're going to have to take up, I think, as part of our regional housing strategy. And it's something that has come up as we've developed the scope of work for that.
I have another question for the audience, really. How many of you found this program interesting and would be interested in having another program that discusses the Cape Cod concept? Raise your hand if you'd be interested in that. Thank you very much. Okay.
Our county is primarily with the influx of tourism, is primarily driven by tourism. And it's a 6-month economy from my perspective, really a 4-month perspective. Have there been efforts to make Cape Cod more of a 12-month or a 6-month or an 8-month? So some of these businesses have annual revenue that tax consultants and accountants like?
Absolutely. I think in just the time that I've been here on the Cape, I've seen kind of those shoulder seasons expand. And while, I think, in previous decades, our primary kind of tourism season was in that, July, August timeframe, we're seeing people arrive earlier and stay longer. And I think with the rise of kind of prevalence of remote work. Those people that, maybe in the past didn't have the flexibility to be here in their second homes are coming here for longer periods of time, or again, earlier, or staying later in the season. And it's certainly something. I was actually reading the Boston Globe earlier today, and I'm forgetting the name of the organization now that identified Cape Cod as a top place to visit in the off season. So that was just something that was, in the Globe today. It's certainly something that we've seen previously, and, something that, our local and regional chambers are certainly, promoting to some extent too, acknowledging that the off season, especially our spring and fall seasons, fall in particular, is becoming more popular, and that the region has a lot to offer during that period of time.
Talk about agriculture in, what's types of agriculture do you have there? Do you have dairy? Do you have big farms, small farms in one section? Are they spread out? We're here in Door County, a lot of our southern area is agriculture. We have a bigger city in the middle, and then most of the tourists are north.
Sure. I would say that agriculture, it's primarily small, small agricultural uses, and they are somewhat spread out. There's not a lot of agriculture in the region, but historically cranberry bogs have been a historical agricultural use in the region, and there are still a number of active cranberry bogs. Just off Cape, there are, it's a very large cranberry agricultural region, but the Cape has kind of limited agriculture compared to our other uses. But I would say they're largely small and fairly spread out across the region.
I have a question related to water quality, and I'm curious, as kind of building off that previous question, how has the commission been able to work with other regions or areas outside of, let's say, your jurisdiction to deal with water quality? Because as we talk about here in Door County, a lot of these dead zones, we're worried about a lot of the phosphorus that's coming in that affects Door County is coming from places like Southern Door, but also Kewaunee County and Brown County as well. So I'm curious how maybe your group has worked with other areas in the region that have an impact on your overall kind of water quality.
Sure. So, primarily our coastal embayments are small, and, we've got Buzzards Bay, which we do share with off Cape communities, and we've got one smaller embayment on Cape Cod that we do share with 2 other off Cape communities to a small extent. But largely the water quality issues that we're facing, just by the nature of our geography, are coming from our own land uses. So in terms of the kind of situations that you might be dealing with there, where some of the inputs are coming from other counties or perhaps other states, that those aren't kind of the same issues that we face here. That being said, we are active participants with what's called the Southeast New England program, which is smaller in geographic area, but somewhat similar in terms of its kind of structure to like the Long Island Sound study or the Chesapeake Bay program, which is kind of a geographic EPA program that focuses on ecological issues, environmental issues, habitat issues. So we are engaged with them. One of their primary focuses is on water quality in the region. And we're part of their steering committee. We participate on a number of their committees related to monitoring and ecosystem services, and really try to work with them and the other entities engaged in that program to identify opportunities for collaboration where we could work with areas outside of our jurisdiction that overall will benefit Cape Cod and other areas of the program's jurisdiction overall. But in terms of those actual inputs, that's kind of a different, the nature of our problem is different than what you might focus or be experiencing in your region.
Last chance. Anybody have a question for Aaron? Oh, we do? Okay.
Aaron, can you hear me?
Yes.
I would just like to thank you for your intelligence, your education, your talents, and your eloquence. You've been able to explain exactly what you've been doing to us. And I think I speak for the whole room that we're very jealous of what you've got going on there. So thank you for portraying what you've done, and you've done a wonderful job. This has been a great presentation. I want to thank you.
Well, thank you. I'm very happy to have been here, and I really do enjoy the work of the commission, and I love to talk about the work we do. So it's been great to do it.